professor and chair for the Department of Government and Politics in the College of Behavioral Social Sciences at the University of Maryland. Tonight, our esteemed panelists will share their insights from the 2020 US presidential campaign trail and take us behind the scenes to explain how President Joe Biden's campaign almost failed, then recovered through a string of game-changing breaks. With extraordinary access to key players in both the Democratic and Republican campaigns, Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes deliver an inside look at power plays, miscalculations, and the struggles within both parties. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Lucky How Joe Biden Barely Won the White House is now available in hardback, ebook, audiobook, and it's published by Penguin Random House. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have a Q&A segment toward the end of the program. I now have the pleasure of introducing tonight's moderator, Margaret Talev, a 1994 graduate of the Merrill College of Journalism. Margaret is a managing editor of politics at Axios, a CNN political analyst. She oversees Axios' White House, politics, and election coverage. Previously, Margaret was a White House correspondent for Bloomberg News, covering US politics and foreign policy, and a past president of the White House Correspondents Association and the Washington Press Club Foundation. Margaret, thanks for being here. I'm gonna hand it over to you and you can take us on this journey together.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to apologize in advance. I somehow, 11 months into it, managed to get COVID. I'm better now, but I was really, really sick for about a month. So my voice is kind of super hoarse and scratchy. So I'm going to try to let Jonathan do all of the talking tonight and then turn it over to Q&A for you guys. But I'm really excited that we get to have this conversation. What I thought we would do is we'll talk back and forth for a couple minutes, and then halfway through at the latest, open it up to everyone who was able to join us today. So as Will said, do go ahead and put your ideas, thoughts, Q&As in that Q&A box, and we'll make sure that we get to your questions. John, before we get started, is there anything you would like to say at the top?
I totally would. I want everyone to know that I've known Margaret Talev since 1989.
When we were two.
When we were two. And just so everyone knows a little bit about their host, I hope this isn't revealing too much. Margaret was a senior in high school when I was a freshman. And I remember her, but she doesn't remember me from back then. But what I remember of Margaret is she was the nice senior who said hello in the hallways to like a nerdy freshman. And it meant a lot to me. And it's the kind of thing that you remember like 30 years later, 32 years later. So I just felt like people should know that about you.
You're just trying to butter me up before we get to the tough questions.
That's right. That's exactly what it is.
Methodology.
But I know you'll kill me anyway.
Well, I mean, it's a fortuitous coincidence of timing that President Biden had his first news conference as president just a few hours ago before our book talk begins. So it seems like the obvious way to start. Did you watch the news conference today? And I'm just really curious, it was about an hour-long news conference. How did what you saw today fit with what you learned about President Biden over the course of reporting Lucky?
So I think a couple of things. Number one, he's somebody who wants to be seen as very serious and substantive. And you saw him today in the press conference talk with detail about a variety of policy issues. Certainly he was referring to notes like most presidents do during their press conferences. But pushing numbers out there and data, and they were factual, and that's largely factual. I mean, you could run a fact check on him, and there were a couple of things he misfired on. But
yeah, right.
It's a stark change from where we were, a year ago at this time, in terms of what you were hearing from the podium at the White House. And then, the other thing is Biden has throughout his career really made a big effort to kind of find middle grounds, or at least appear to be finding middle grounds. And I thought one answer today was like really instructive about that, where he was asked about his border policy. And he said, look, we're sending most of the people back. The vast majority of people who come across the border are going back. And that's not music to the ears of the immigrant rights advocates who voted for Joe Biden or worked for his election. That's very much not music to their ears. He's maintained a big part of this Title 42 policy that President Trump had in place, which actually comes from the CDC and is, Trump used it in relation to the pandemic to say people shouldn't be coming in. And so, except with the exception of unaccompanied minors, and I think some minors with family members, everybody else is getting sent back across the Mexican border as fast as the government can do to process asylum requests and cases there. So I thought that was an interesting sort of, call it triangulation if you want, or a distancing from the extremes of both parties in regard to his immigration answer. And of course, the way he distanced from the Trump extreme was that he actually cares about saying that he cares about the migrant children, and he thinks that what's going on the border is unacceptable. Donald Trump's policy was designed to be harsh. I think Biden is literally dealing with some of the same issues and is talking about it in a much different way.
And just as a side note to all that, it is actually the one statement he made that has been fact checked the most, because while that may potentially become true at some point in terms of people being turned back, that's not what the stats show right now. And it is, the Biden administration will tell you that's because there's a process and they have to, sort of go through this, but it's not actually statistically true. What he said right now, it is not supported by the stats, right? But
that's where he wants to be politically.
But
he wants people to believe he's turning away the vast majority of people. And I think when you're dealing with adults, it is the majority. And it's the question of adults with children. It's the family question.
But it's this idea of the middle ground. You heard that idea of the middle ground a lot today. Was there anything else that you heard in his messaging today from the news conference that either surprised you because you're like, that's out of place for President Biden's brand, or that struck you as kind of like spot on? Like his answers to the filibuster question were sort of interesting. There wasn't that much, to me, there wasn't that much news today in the press conference, but there was a lot of insight into how he thinks about governing or how he thinks about being effective as a president. Like he shared a lot of his thinking about his own strategy for how to prioritize certain things. And I'm wondering if any of that surprised you, or whether you could have told us in December that this is precisely how he would arrange and approach things.
I think that to your point, like this was a very Biden-esque moment in the sort of positive way of kind of trying to be like a little bit newsy, but controlling what the news is, that sort of aim at the centrist path that we were talking about. And also in terms of struggling to get through his answers, and sometimes seemingly like lost in his own sentences. And I don't mean that in a cognitive way. I just mean, anybody who's talked to Biden for a long time knows the guy will literally he could have taken one question and gone for an hour on it and expounded at length on his views and philosophy of governance, since the time of the Romans. And at the risk of doing that myself, I'll stop there. But the short answer is I wasn't surprised by any of it.
Well, let's start with the book then, and then we can come back to today. Your book is called Lucky. There were a lot of titles you could have chosen for the book. Why did you choose Lucky?
So there were so many things that went Joe Biden's way, and the election was so close. And I know people who are watching, some of them are saying to themselves, wait a second, he won 81 million to 74 million. That's not so close. That's 4.5%. That's not terribly close. The Electoral College margin 306 to 232 is the same as Trump over Hillary Clinton. Trump claimed that he had won a gigantic Electoral College victory, and his critics said he hadn't. But in order to get to a second Trump presidency, President Trump would have only had to win 43,000 votes over 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. In each of those states, the margin of victory was like less than 2/3 of a point. If you talk to anybody who does campaigns, they would say a statewide campaign within 1% is essentially a toss-up. So you start from, this is super close at the end to having gone the other way. If Trump wins those 3 states, it gets 269 electoral votes. It gets thrown to the House. Little civics lesson here, gets thrown to the House, and there are 26 majority Republican House delegations. in order to win the presidency when it's thrown to the House, each state has one vote. You need a majority of them. Trump would have had that. Even to get to 270 electoral votes, he would have needed another 20,000 or so in Nebraska's second district, which can be broken off as a as a single electoral vote. And even if you add that into the mix, you're talking about, I'm doing quick math here, but under 65,000 votes. I remember in 2016, everybody thought Hillary Clinton lost by such a small margin in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Her total in those three was 77,000, more than either of those scenarios for Trump. So I think you start backward from like, this is a super close election. What made the difference? And the thing is, like, both in the primary and the general election, Biden had a series, and we'll get to each of these, had a series of sort of fortuitous events that kind of went his way that were externalities to his campaign, right? Just briefly, I mean, you know, he was going to come in fourth in Iowa. There was a poll that got spiked, the Des Moines Register poll. Everyone in Iowa looks to that. It's both bellwether of where everything is and also an influencer of voters within the last couple of days. The Buttigieg campaign decides to get that poll spiked, you know, by making a complaint. Biden had nothing to do with that. It spares him 2 days of being, you know, the biggest loser. The Iowa caucuses themselves, the reporting app for those results, if people remember, totally screwed up, absolute fail. Nobody knew who had won or exactly who had come in what order. Spares Biden another, you know, sort of horrendous news cycle of coming in fourth place. In New Hampshire, it gets down to $1.5 million, to the point where his campaign aides come to him and say, you know, basically you're going to have to refinance your house to keep the salaries going, which he doesn't end up doing. But I mean, you get a sense of like sort of how like close to the bone it is that he's actually knocked down. I mean, his aides are, the subtext of what his aides are telling him when they say you might have to refinance his house and put money in the campaign is they think it's time to wrap up the campaign. And then in Nevada, he gets Elizabeth Warren just takes out Mike Bloomberg, who at the moment is like looming over his shoulder as the next establishment favorite, you know, kind of like a vulture waiting for Biden to, you know, politically die so that he can come in and swoop in and take the establishment. And Warren, having nothing to do with Biden, hates Mike Bloomberg so much that she eviscerates him. And you sort of go through these things. You know, he gets this endorsement from Jim Clyburn, which, you know, part of that is Biden working for it, but the level of Clyburn's endorsement and the effect that it had both in South Carolina in terms of running up those margins and convincing the rest of the Democratic establishment that Biden should be the choice after such a terrible first run of 3 states. You just look at all this and you're like kind of, as one source put it to me and Amy, my co-author, who by the way is not here because she is sick from her COVID shot today. But one source put it to us, you know, with Warren and Clyburn, you know, in typical fashion, the white woman and the black man do all the work and the white guy walks away with the prize. And then in the general election, Trump just keeps shooting himself in the foot. I mean, you know, most presidents, if a crisis like COVID happened, they would see it as an opportunity to rally people around the flag. They'd see it as a moment of compassion. And Trump just booted that away. And so take the combination of all these things and you just, and people on Biden's campaign said to us like, that they felt if Trump had even shown a little more compassion, that Biden would have lost. Anita Dunn told an associate, Anita Dunn was one of the top Biden advisors. She told an associate, COVID's the best thing that ever happened to Joe Biden because it allowed him to step back away from the campaign trail where he was gaffe prone and watch Donald Trump, you know, essentially destroy himself from the White House briefing room. So, you know, you put all that together and also, I should say, the other piece, Joe Biden is somebody, and he said it today, he's a respecter of faith. When you listen to Joe Biden talk, he talks about luck all the time. He talks about, you know, occasionally he talks about it as divine intervention. Sometimes he says fate or fortune, and sometimes he talks specifically about luck. This is a guy who really believes that there are certain things outside of your control that affect your circumstances. And certainly having run for president 3 times before, not as a much different man than he is now, and having gotten nowhere, he knows that there are forces outside your control. So that's the starting point. And then the second piece of it is the Democratic Party was lucky that it nominated Joe Biden. You know, you can't do a counterfactual, but it would be hard to make the argument that anybody else, you know, would have beaten Trump in this particular election. And as we saw the Capitol riot, the storming of the Capitol in January, you know, I think the country's lucky that the Republic held. So all of those things went into lucky, and I'm sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it was a great answer. And I'll add one addendum if I can do a spoiler alert, which is that at the very end of the book, you learn that Joe Biden's father used to have a quote about luck. Isn't that right? And he would say that it's the lucky person who gets up in the morning, puts both feet on the floor, knows what they're about to do, and thinks it still matters. Do you recognize that in Biden?
Absolutely, 100%. This is a guy who's sort of full of, he's full of that sort of spirit about public service. And it doesn't mean that it's not, that he doesn't have ego or ambition or any of those other things that drive politicians. He has them in full measure. Not only did he run for president 3 times, he thought about it 4 or 5 other times. I mean, he definitely, you know, there's definitely a sort of pride in him. And you see that in this book, and particularly with the conflict that he has with Obama over sort of, you know, which one's the better politician. And we can talk a little bit about that, but he's a proud guy, and he is somebody who at the same time really does, I think, have this sort of belief in public service and belief that he's here to do something. And so, yeah, I think he gets up out of bed every morning, puts his feet on the floor, has something to do, and thinks it still matters. And that's why we ended the book with it.
I want to talk about Obama and their relationship in a minute. Just as a final note to the book title, what were your backup titles? And if he had lost, would you have called it Unlucky?
We had thought Battered, because our last book was Shattered, but I didn't like the rhyme scheme, so I don't think we weren't that far along yet.
Okay, terrific. I did want to ask you this. I'm sort of curious how reporting out a book on Hillary Clinton was different from reporting out a book on Joe Biden, and not the obvious answer, which is that she didn't win and he did. Like, skip that. But I mean, in terms of you know, working the inside circle, or juxtaposing what you thought you knew about the person versus what you learned about the person, what were the two experiences like?
I think there are a couple of things. Number one, the Biden message is much more that Biden himself is not always disciplined, but the Biden team's message was very disciplined by comparison. I think it was very difficult by comparison to get Biden people to get them to talk about things they didn't want to talk about, to get all of them to talk. And also the inner circle of Biden is like a much sort of closer, smaller set. And they are people who are involved in Washington politics, and, you know, we know them. But the set of people in Hillary land who can credibly claim to know what's going on at any given moment is wider. And so this was difficult in that way. And then the other complication is COVID. I mean, we're not on the campaign trail. There is no campaign trail. You know, with the Clinton folks, they're all out around and traveling, and you see them and run into them in places. You can pick up little bits of information here and there. And they're also touching other people who you talk to, you know, and I don't mean physically touching, but like they're also interacting with other people you talk to in a much more, you know, the kind of way that you do when you're having a beer with someone instead of on a Zoom that says recording in the corner of it. So
did you see what percentage of your sources did you see in person for this book?
After COVID started, 0. All phone the entire time.
Was that easy in any way, or was it just harder all the way around?
It's harder all the way around. There's so many ways in which sources can give you information when you're interviewing them, and to have all of your senses available to like see people's reactions to things, you know, shrugs, nods, whatever. It's just it's a harder barrier to break through. And even in a, you know, if you sit down with somebody, often the interview's longer. Like if you do 2 hours on the phone with somebody, it's like brutal for everyone.
Right.
But
100%.
if you sit down with somebody, you could do 2 hours and it's no problem. And one of the things we noticed in Shattered, there was one particular interview we did where we started to notice a tick when the person lied. And then we were able to go back in the transcript. It wasn't a physical tick. It was a few words that they used every time they said something, because we knew there were 2 or 3 things they said that were untrue. And we just kind of noticed like, oh, they keep saying this. And so we went back and looked at the transcript and we were able to pick out the lies. And, you know, like, and I think that wouldn't have happened had we not been in the room with that person. 2 people, one of the great things about having a writing partner and a reporting partner is that you have multiple vantage points on the same subject. And so when one of you is asking a question, the other one may be watching what they're doing, or they fumbling with their hands, that kind of thing. And we lost all of that. And yet at the same time, I think we succeeded in getting people a lot closer to what was going on in Biden world than they would have gotten from, from all the daily reporting.
Did you do any of the interviews on Zoom, or were they mostly by phone, ended up being by phone?
All by phone.
So you really couldn't see folks.
Yeah, and even if we could, I mean, I don't, for whatever reason, I feel like somebody doing an interview, like a formal interview on Zoom, just sort of I actually thought that the phone would work better, that people would feel more comfortable. It's like you're more likely to say something stupid on radio than you are on television, because you can relax.
Yeah, well, that's 100% true. When you're reporting out a book in real time and it's going to publish basically right after the outcome, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be, are people participating because they wanted to write the best possible story about Biden to validate him even after he lost, or because they thought he was going to win and they wanted to shape history? Like, why did the people who you convinced to work with you on the book decide to work with you on the book?
It's a great question. I think for each of them, the answer is a little bit different, but there are a few reasons. I mean, one of them is ego. People like to be involved in something. They want to, they want to be part of the project. One of the reasons is to keep tabs on us. So certainly, people in like the communications area for Biden, some of them were like trying to keep tabs on where we were. And what
So they wanted to know what you were hearing, because that would help them understand the larger media ecosystem.
Correct. And also just because they want to know what's going to be said in the book. And then the other, the other reasons are, and we try to stress this to people all the time. It's like, we're doing our best to write what happened, and we can only do the justice to it that we, have available to us through the people who talk to us. And like, if you don't talk to us, like, not only, I mean, it's not like a threat, like we're going to be mean to you, or like, in my view, and some reporters work that way. We don't work that way at all. But in my view, like, you're losing your opportunity to have your perspective represented in the book. And maybe there are other people who have the same perspective and we're privy to the same meetings or whatever. But usually what we find is if 6 people are in the same meeting, we have 6 different perspectives on what happened, memories. I mean, somebody will be like, there was District Taco on the table, and somebody else will be like, no, it was Sparrow, like, I mean, so it's actually one of the challenges is when you get discrepancies like that on little details that you have to like really try to chase down, whether it was District Taco or the pizza place that people were eating. And that can be challenging. But I think we're pretty successful with, like, we're trying to get out something that's like historical and serious. And there are people who were not fans of, Shattered, certainly, or like sort of, and there were people who weren't fans of our first book, HRC. But I think most of the people who dealt with us on those books, and I think the people that dealt with us on Lucky, would tell you that, like, we took this seriously, and that the reporting in there is serious. And I think one of the reasons for that is, we include some of those sort of gossipy details that are interesting and people like want to like chew over, but we make a real effort to make sure that we're not including stuff like that that doesn't have a bearing on anything. It really has to tell you something about the larger story for us to include. I mean, there's plenty of cool stuff on the cutting room floor.
I promised to go to a couple of questions in a couple minutes, but I had a couple more questions I wanted to ask you first. One is just this: like, you'd covered Biden for many years before the campaign. You covered him as a senator, you covered him as vice president. Was there anything that you learned in the reporting of this book that you just didn't know about him before, or that you changed your mind about in the reporting of it, either about his personality, his motivation, what drives him? What was like revelatory to you in your reporting?
I think the driving ambition, even to this day, and sort of the self-confidence, or belief in himself, is really something to behold. And there are so many people who believe that he's crazy to believe in himself, that thought he was crazy to believe that he could run for president at 78 years old and win. And this is a guy who, like, when everything is down against the mat, is absolutely 100% confident that he can persevere and come through it. And he cheers people up around him. He's somebody who's conscientious about what is the mood of his staff, what are the mood of the advisors around him. At one point we write about how he had to keep telling Jill Biden, just hang in there. We're gonna get through this and make it to South Carolina. And anybody who's married knows that if you're telling your spouse just hang in there, it's because your spouse has lost confidence in the project.
It's funny because I've also covered now President Biden for, whatever, 20 years or something. And even so, your book really crystallized for me what an intensely political animal he is underneath kind of the surface of, like Uncle Joe, and he's such a nice guy and that kind of shtick, that it's like way fiercer underneath than it appears on the outside. Speaking of lack of confidence or his own confidence exceeding everybody else's confidence in him, and during the primary, he was a pretty lonely candidate. The donors didn't believe in him. The Democratic Party leadership didn't believe in him. I was really struck by passages in your book where you talk about Barack Obama's own doubts in Biden, not in Biden as a person, not in Biden as a leader or someone with the ability to govern, but in Biden as a candidate and in Biden's ability to survive the primaries in particular, and Obama's desire that Biden not embarrass his own legacy and Obama's legacy in the process. And I'm wondering, to the extent that you know the answer to this, whether that has shaken the closeness or the core of their relationship going forward.
I mean, I think it absolutely has. The question, I think, is two questions. One is, and this is always a question with politicians that say that they're close, like, how close are they really, right? Biden was deeply resentful that Obama crowded him out of the 2016 campaign by giving his imprimatur to Hillary Clinton, even though he didn't endorse her. His people were pushing for her. They went to Biden and told Biden that he needed to stay out. Biden went to talk to Obama about it. Obama was not encouraging. Obama was not going to endorse him this time. As we report in the book, Biden said that he went to Obama and asked him not to endorse this time. And that never happened. And to your point, there's a scene where Obama calls in Biden's aides early on, before Biden even announces, and says, look, it's not that I expect him to lose, it's that because I think he will, but I'm worried that he's going to embarrass himself and tarnish his legacy. And Obama doesn't say it explicitly, but implicitly tarnish the Obama legacy. And he's sort of like, and he frames it like, Joe's my friend. I don't want to see him suffer. But the truth is the two of them have this sort of, they describe it as like a mentor-mentee relationship over these years, and they disagree about who's the mentor and who's the mentee. I mean, Biden's watching Obama do politics and thinking to himself, like, this guy's messing stuff up. And Obama's looking at Biden going, man, this guy can't give a speech. But to your point about Biden's like an intensely political animal, this is his 10th election, 10th general election. He's won all 10 of them, going back to New County Castle, Board of Supervisors or whatever. So, Biden's been really good at trying, he aims for that middle, as we were talking about before, and he's been very good at finding a place to be that makes him appear to be with the majority, or if not with the majority, at least in a reasonable place. We use as a device for that, we sort of use where he has been on race issues over the course of his career and some of the turns that he made on those. But you could do the same thing with, we didn't focus on this as much, but he had a big change on abortion, on federal funding for abortion in this campaign. And he's had a change on trade. He was one of the chief free traders of the United States Senate for decades and decades. And now he gets asked whether he's going to keep tariffs on China today at the press conference, and he just dodges it completely. Because the answer is he probably is for the moment. And if he does repeal them, he certainly doesn't want people to think that he's going light on China. Biden has been in almost every imaginable place on every issue over the course of 50 years. But at any given moment, he's in a place that seems reasonable and between the poles.
Slightly left of center.
Yeah, slightly left of center, but not crazy left of center. You know what I mean?
And your other title for the book, slightly left of center. And who knows, he may change his mind on the filibuster. It certainly seems like he's open to the possibility. Here's what I want to do. I want to talk to you about his relationship with Kamala, his relationship with Jill, but I also want to be mindful of our audience. So why don't we begin to move, why don't I start incorporating some questions and then maybe try to tuck in a couple of mine as we go, if that works.
Okay.
Terrific. Okay. Well, let's start with the hot one. Why was Anita Dunn brought on, given her connection, her toxic connection to Harvey Weinstein?
Ooh. So the second part of that, I have a harder time answering. But they obviously didn't think any connection she had to anybody was a problem, because she was as close of an advisor as there was to Biden during the course of this campaign, and became more close over time, taking over as his interim campaign manager, essentially engineering a soft coup against the first campaign manager, Greg Schultz, and installing Jen O'Malley Dillon, who eventually was the general election campaign manager. And, you know, Dunn has been around, and I should note this, she also went to the high school that Margaret Talev and I went to.
Did she
Before
go
us.
to like BCC? Did she go to WJ?
She went to WJ. So,
okay.
I mean, she's been in politics since the Carter administration, where she no doubt worked with Tom Donilon, who's the brother of Mike Donilon. Mike Donilon being, you know, sort of the Biden whisperer of Biden world. And she, you know, she's worked on presidential campaigns, Bill Bradley's presidential campaign, Barack Obama's campaigns. I mean, she's somebody who's very trusted to be both, I think, effective as a manager, effective as a communicator, and very smart about what information gets out. That is to say, not somebody who's like no information can ever come out, but very smart about guarding information and knowing where to put it when. So, you know, I mean, I think if Joe Biden were to pick, you know, the MVPs of his campaign, it would be probably in descending order, like Jim Clyburn, Anita Dunn, Jen O'Malley Dillon, right? Like, I mean, that's your, that's sort of your all-star team for him.
Great. So let's move to another question. Mark asks, what other candidate had the best chance to win South Carolina besides Biden? And why weren't other Democratic primary candidates able to break through there?
So ironically, maybe Mike Bloomberg, but he was not going to be on the ballot in South Carolina. But he was polling reasonably well in South Carolina for somebody who wasn't even on the ballot because of all the advertising. But among the candidates who were on the ballot, you know, I think the likelihood was that Biden was going to win as long as he was on the ballot there. It was really a question of margins. And I think he ended up winning after the Clyburn endorsement. Before the Clyburn endorsement, he was up about 12 points. After the Clyburn endorsement, he ends up winning like 49 to like 20 for Sanders, something like it was almost a 30-point win, I think. And that owes to the two sort of pillars of his coalition in the primary, which are an interesting pair, the moderate whites and African Americans of sort of all political stripes, but particularly older and more moderate African Americans, many of whom I think voted for Biden in part because he was popular with moderate whites. Not that they necessarily agreed with the politics of the moderate whites, but they agreed with the politics of getting rid of Trump. And they looked at moderate white voters as people who might be drawn to Trump, and or vice versa, people that Biden might be able to draw away from Trump. And so there's a political sophistication in the African American electorate that I think often gets ignored because you see a lot of block voting. And so it's, you know, say, oh, well, the black voters voted for this candidate, or the black voters voted for the Democrats, and it's like 80% or 90% in the election. And I think a lot of people sort of lose the texture of that political sophistication of sort of understanding what the best interests are, and using the political power of a unified vote to you know, exact the outcome that's wanted. So, you know, I think it's hard to say what would have happened if a Kamala Harris had made it to South Carolina and Joe Biden was struggling. That might have been something that would have made a difference, or Cory Booker, but like, they were so far out of it. I mean, you know, Booker dropped out early, Harris dropped out early. It's hard to say. It's hard to see anybody but Biden winning with Biden on the ballot. Without Biden on the ballot, maybe Elizabeth Warren.
Clyburn's role in the race and as kind of a change maker and a rainmaker, a turning point in the campaign, So important. And it's something you write about in a lot of detail. I mean, the moments, the conversations, Clyburn's reactions in the moment. But even more broadly, like African Americans have been so important to Joe Biden's success throughout his career, but particularly, I would say, like since the time where he joined President Obama's ticket, right? From Barack Obama to Simone Sanders and Biden's campaign efforts to recruit her, the reasons why that was so pivotal inside Democratic Party politics, to Jim Clyburn's role, to the role of Black voters themselves in terms of turnout in the general election, and the particulars of the past year of 2020 with the death of George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter. Can you talk a little bit about how much of a factor race was, you think, in the tone, the tenor, the turnout of the election? And given all that, do you think that Black Americans are sufficiently reflected in Joe Biden's kind of leadership team and key decision makers now inside the administration?
I mean, short answer, I don't think that the inner Biden circle is reflective of the influence Black voters had in electing him. So no, there aren't enough Black advisors represented in that really tight leadership circle that are influential in what's going on. First of all, I mean, Ron Klain is obviously running this White House, with a pretty strong hand, and he is not Black. So starting from there, but then the sort of top advisor group, Mike Donnellan and Steve Ricchetti, I mean, like, Anita Dunn-Still. I mean, this is a group that is not only where it's a tight circle that is almost entirely white. It is also a group of people who reflect the sort of centrist white guy politics of Joe Biden. And you think of it, like, I think of it as the difference of Biden being, it's sort of like Lyndon Johnson. Like Lyndon Johnson and George Wallace for many years probably sounded a lot alike, but they would have governed very differently. I mean, George Wallace obviously didn't become president, and Lyndon Johnson did. But I think one of the things we go through in the book is this intense pressure from within the Biden campaign for him to get more to the left on police reform in the wake of the George Floyd shooting and all of the protests for racial justice across the country, and how his inner circle really and Biden ultimately batted that back. There were people on his campaign who had been hired in part because their relationships in the African American community, hired onto his campaign, because of those relationships, and we're saying to him, you need to apologize for the crime bill. You need to say defund the police. And Biden's inner circle is really resistant to that. Now, that said, the African Americans who are close to that inner circle, including Jim Clyburn and including Cedric Richmond, who is his national co-chairman and is now, I think, head of public engagement for the White House, the old Valerie Jarrett job. They also, to the extent that they're influential, they share one thing with Joe Biden, really more than anything else, which is that they believe that in order to govern, you have to win. And so their sense of politics is, even though Jim Clyburn's personal political preferences may be to the left of Joe Biden's, often his pragmatic approach to getting things done is very reflective of Biden's. And we have a scene in the book where Clyburn sits down with John Lewis during the protest for racial justice, and he says that they're sitting on the floor, and Clyburn's like, "What do you think about this defund the police thing?" And John Lewis is like, "Look, burn baby burn killed us," meaning the nonviolent civil rights movement in the '60s that sort of became more aggressive. Lewis was replaced by Stokely Carmichael on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Lewis says, "Burn baby burn killed us. Defund the police is going to kill Black Lives Matter." And what he meant was, what is being agitated for and what is being pushed is sort of too much for the whole of America to get behind, and that the slogan is such a turnoff to the middle that it threatens the viability of Democratic candidates. And we saw that down ballot from Biden. Biden went out there very aggressively and said, I'm not for defund the police, and Trump still said that he was for defund the police. But I think had Biden, equivocated on that, it would have been very difficult for him. And particularly when you look at the outcome, one of the people you didn't mention was Stacey Abrams. If you look at what she did in Atlanta, that is not replicated in other major cities in this past election. The increase in votes for the Democratic ticket in Philadelphia was minimal compared to like 21 or 22% of increase there was from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden nationally, right? So you go into Philadelphia and it's like maybe 3% more people voted for Democrats than last time, as opposed to like 22%. You go into Detroit, there were actually fewer votes for Joe Biden than there were for Hillary Clinton in the city of Detroit. Go to Milwaukee, precinct after precinct in Milwaukee, black turnout was actually down a little bit from 2016. And where did Joe Biden win in those states? He won in the mostly white, little wealthier suburbs of Philadelphia, between Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware. So a little hometown advantage there. He won in huge in Dane County, Wisconsin, which is where Madison is, which is pretty white and educated and wealthy. And then you look in Michigan, it's those suburbs around Detroit, which are like the other suburbs in the other cities are somewhat mixed, but certainly not the African American population that you're looking at in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee. And I'm sorry, that was like probably a nerdy election analysis answer.
This is a good place to be if you're going to be nerdy, talking about American politics for an hour. We have a couple more questions that I want to make sure I get to, and then I've got a couple more. Someone who, anonymous, might have joined us late, asking what would the name of the book have been if Biden lost? Battered was one of the contenders. Was there another one, or was that your? That was your.
Well, that was the sort of placeholder, but like there was definitely, we weren't set on it. I mean, Lucky was something that sort of developed during the primary. When we were looking at Biden getting through the primary, like, this guy gets through here. I mean, it's an amazing amount of luck. And we talked to, it's the other thing is, it's not our analysis so much as what people inside Biden world were telling us, about the political bullets they dodged. They were ecstatic about some of the things that happened that went their way. And even though they would say at the time, oh, the press hates us, or this person hates us, they're watching these breaks go their way, and they're like, it's amazing that we held on. And one of his really close confidants said to us, anybody who's being honest with you would tell you that the stars aligned for Joe Biden.
Rosemary Usman has a question that I think many folks were thinking as Biden was answering this today during the news conference. Biden said today it's his intention to run in 2024. Do you believe that to be true based on your reporting?
Absolutely. Joe Biden's wanted to be president for as long as Joe Biden can remember. He thought about running in 1980, which would have been the first year he was eligible. And by the way, when his fellow Democrat Jimmy Carter was in office. So Joe Biden's always wanted this job. I firmly believe he's running until he's not. And maybe there's a point in 2 or 3 years where he says to himself, I've gotten everything done that I wanted to, or I lost a little off my fastball, or I want to hang out with the grandchildren. But typically when politicians tell you they want to spend more time with their family, they're lying.
If anyone else has got a question, we've only got a couple minutes left, but I will try to get it in. We haven't talked yet about two really important figures in Joe Biden's life. And one is his wife, Jill Biden, and the other is his running mate and now Vice President Kamala Harris. Let's take Harris first, and then we can talk about Jill. What's the relationship like? How's it evolved in the short time that they've been partners?
I think winning together breeds some love. I think they're closer now than they ever have been. And part of that is the physical proximity of Joe Biden incorporating Kamala Harris into what he does. And some people could read that as Biden wanting to help mentor her and sort of, foster her political development in order to hand off to her at some point. And other people could read it as him not wanting to let her get out of his sight and do her own politicking. And my guess is both are probably true. But, we report in the book about how Kamala Harris sort of set up to go after Joe Biden in the debate in Miami in June of 2019. and the thinking that went into, like, sort of all the planning that went into the hit that she dropped on him on school busing, and you know, how angry he and his people were, and not only how angry they were, but like how sort of side spun they were. I mean, they had to meet and figure out like what to say.
It took the wind out of him. They never thought that was coming. He didn't think she would do that to him.
Right. I mean, we look, you know, because he says, you know, she was friends with Beau, his son, and, you know, Beau is somebody obviously he loves very deeply, but, you know, on a political level, Beau is somebody that he uses, you know, as a shield against competitors and fellow Democrats at times during the campaign, and against Trump even in the general election. So, you know, he's surprised by it. He looks at Pete Buttigieg at the next commercial break during that debate, and then he goes, "This is just a bunch of bullshit." And he's just steamed, and like he's resentful of it. And so you get to the point where he's like looking for a vice presidential candidate, and like obviously it starts with Kamala Harris. He's already narrowed down, promised he's going to appoint a woman. You have the George Floyd, you know, the post George Floyd protests. Amy Klobuchar takes herself out of the running and says he should choose a Black woman. Like, it's moving in that direction, and Biden is like coming up with new Black women to bring into the process. You know, he's looking for someone else. And a couple of days before, and we go through sort of all the machinations of that in the book, but a couple of days before Biden announces his decision, he calls Clyburn and he says, "Hey, I'm having a real struggle between my head and my heart." And obviously his head is Kamala Harris. She's sitting United States Senator. She's, you know, good in the spotlight. She's got all the sort of things that you would want a vice presidential candidate to have, including the fact that maybe her most popular group is educated suburban women of all colors, which is a group that Biden definitely needed to energize for this race and keep on board. So, his head is Harris, but obviously his heart ain't there yet. And he seems to be like asking Clyburn for permission, maybe to pick someone else. And he's thinking about Susan Rice, and he's thinking about Gretchen Whitmer, the Michigan governor, and there are people close to him, you know, that are pushing Whitmer because they see her as more aligned with Biden, somebody who sort of reinforces his message. And I mean, ultimately, he does the entire process of elimination. It takes him a long time. He blows through his own deadline for it. All the women are fighting each other and dropping opposition research on each other. And ultimately, he comes down to what the obvious choice was, which is Kamala Harris. And I think that, like I said, I think winning, you know, breeds some love for a while. So I think they're probably in a pretty good place right now. But there's also people who got assigned to her staff who are Biden people. You know, Simone Sanders being one of them. You know, who I think are there to keep an eye on her.
And he also just took that whole border thing and made it her responsibility. So do you think that has the potential to hobble a future presidential campaign for her, or do you think that has the ability to empower her?
Well, you know, if she figures out immigration, like all of the many presidents since Ronald Reagan who have figured out immigration, then you know, it's a good thing for her. But as you hint, I think he handed off a shit sandwich to her and said, "Hey, you're in charge of this." You know, it's reminiscent of Trump handing Mike Pence the coronavirus task force, or in, you know, before most of the people watching this were born, Bill Clinton handing his healthcare plan to Hillary Clinton and saying, "Here, you go deal with this." It both speaks to the urgency of the issue and the president's lack of desire to deal with it personally.
Yeah, or Obama handing Biden a couple of rosy ones himself.
He asked him to solve cancer.
Well, that one made more sense, but some, you know, there are a couple of the Middle Eastern portfolios or economic recovery issues early on. Those were tough. Sheriff Biden. I think your last answer got to Sunshine's question, which is, why did Biden choose Harris even though Democrats gave her 2% confidence? She says so. But there is a difference between being a viable presidential candidate in a 25-person race and being a good running mate, right? I mean, there's different sort of strategic hurdles and imperatives.
I mean, Joe Biden was a good vice presidential candidate for Barack Obama, and he'd gotten 1% in Iowa. Mike Pence was about to lose his gubernatorial reelection in Indiana. There are a lot of different models you can have for a vice presidential candidate, but one of them is to balance your ticket in some way. And she balanced it in terms of being younger, in terms of being a woman, in terms of being a person of color, a person of, you know, two identities of color in terms of African American and South Asian. And so she brought in geographical balance, but more important than anything else, she polled well. They did extensive polling on who he should pick as his vice presidential candidate, and she was better known than other people and less offensive among the people that knew her than some of the others. I mean, there's a point at which Biden tells Stacey Abrams, like, nobody knows who you are. Like, I think you'd be great at the job, but nobody knows who you are. Like, not as many people know who you are as know who Susan Rice is. And Susan Rice has never run for office. And, we sort of go through the picks that Biden had, and none of them were, particularly well known. The other option was potentially Elizabeth Warren in terms of somebody who was well known. And he had actually offered her in 2015 that and we report this in the book for the first time, if he had run for president and won the nomination in 2015, he offered her the VP slot if she would endorse him in that race. Of course, he never ran. And then even though he thought back then that she would be the best vice presidential candidate, he now thinks that she's not the next best person to run the White House, which I always think is kind of funny. Like, and Obama didn't endorse Biden, even though he told the country twice that Joe Biden was the next best person to be president.
But if you're a respecter of fate, that all makes sense, right? Before we run out of time, let's share your thoughts on Jill Biden. There are many different models for first ladies. When I think of Jill Biden, I think as the woman who threw herself between Joe Biden and the milk protesters or whatever they were. What are the two things we need to know about Jill Biden?
Number one, she's ramrod. Like, he talks about like the iron core of the United States. Like, Jill Biden is like I don't know what's the term, like his iron, like his strong core.
Protector.
He's a protector and source of strength and somebody who keeps score, who remembers the slights, and somebody who is very, this is the last thing I'll say about her, somebody who's clearly like very translatable to people as kind of normal.
Will we see her involved in policy?
I don't think we'll see her involved in major policy, except with the possible exception of education, particularly higher education.
We're almost done, but I'm going to ask you two more questions. Can Joe Biden get anything done as president without ending the filibuster?
Yes, if he chooses to go a path that, like, sort of Bill Clinton did, which is, you're a left of center president and you go take on issues that the right likes and give them a slightly right of center cast and move them through Congress 60 votes. But like the left will never forgive Biden for doing that. So I think it's.
I was going to say the progressive wing is in a completely different size and scope and power position, and the country's different than it was under Bill Clinton.
In some ways, but also Biden's election is kind of a rejection of the leftward move for Obama, right? I mean, if you looked at Joe Biden's positioning, it's between Obama and Trump on so many issues. I mean, as president, Biden's been more to the left, but if you look at where he campaigned in between them. And, so I think that, I think he can get things done, but he can't get the things he wants to get done.
Yeah. So do you think that 4 years from now, there'll still be a legislative filibuster?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then it doesn't matter.
Because there aren't the votes in the Senate to get rid of it.
And you don't think that'll change? You don't think there's any deal or negotiation or compromise or hardball or LBJ tactic or whatever that's going to change Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, Angus King's minds? And
remember, those are only the ones that are publicly out there.
Yeah.
There are others that don't want to vote on it at all.
Do we know this for a fact, or is it too soon to say this? Will COVID be both the defining issue of Joe Biden's election and of Joe Biden's presidency?
I think it's hard to imagine what issue would. Well, first of all, it depends on how many years he's in office, right? If it's one term, I think it's hard to imagine that it's not the defining issue, right? I mean, he just spent $2 trillion on it. He's going to, reap the benefits not only of his own ability to get drugs out to people, but also what Trump had started before him. And so I think, he's in a really good position to take advantage of that and make that his legacy. He slayed the plague. I mean, that's a pretty good legacy.
stuff as much into budgeting and COVID funding and stimulus funding as you can as a proxy until you can get the filibuster done. We have 2 minutes left. I want to thank you very much for our conversation, and I want to turn the microphone back over to Jenny to take us out. But thanks again for having both of us.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Jonathan, for just doing a fantastic job. Just going to do a Zoom clap. And Jonathan, thank you for writing this book and sharing your experiences and insight with us. And again, I'm going to do another plug. If you hadn't already, you want to get more of that tea that Jonathan was talking about, definitely feel free to order a copy of your book. Again, it's available for purchase now. You can get online. And again, thank you. Just want to give a shout out to an upcoming event that we're hosting next week. So the Department of Government and Politics is hosting their annual Feller Lecture, which will be hosted on Wednesday, March 31st, which will feature a conversation with fellow TERP alum, Congressman Eric Swalwell, who I'm sure you sort of maybe met, but he kind of dropped out early on in the campaign trail, but nonetheless, very vocal. So it should be another great conversation, and I will send out the link for that event. And with that, we are at time. Thank you so much, and we'll see you hopefully next week.
Bye, Margaret. Thank you.